Takes a second, but it seems to be taking longer and longer. I don't remember it used to take this long, but. All right, we are now recording. Okay, so we were just recapping some of the sort of solution requirements that we had started to talk about last time. I will stop rehashing them all because I think we're all sort of familiar with it and we can see them here. So I guess, to open it up, are there things here that well, what are the gaps that, as folks read through this, we think we're missing? Are there things folks want to sort of drill into and discuss some of these things? I know I need to sort of page this list back in and see. Oh, also, I see a bunch of folks signing in. Yes, please go add yourself up.
The Cosigned Repository, the fourth bullet, 1, 2, 3, yeah, fourth one. So that is, there was the issue that I opened, because right now you can do it with just one, where you can say, actually YOLO, my stuff is here, but there might, I just want to make sure that that's captured, that we don't think that that just one fits all.
Yeah, so that's a good, I'm gonna just quickly see. Whether there are some good issues here that we can link over here as well. So let's see. That looks like it would be
594 is particularly interesting. I think these are already referenced.
This is the issue Vila was talking about. Yeah, this is sort of the issue that started it all. Okay, so this is like keys from KMS systems, which I think we've talked about. I don't know if it's on here. So multiple keys. I'm just gonna see. Support for. I'm gonna put a question mark here because mainly what we want are public keys. So I don't know how folks feel about that, but it's interesting from the perspective of stuff like rotation. So continuous checking. This is a whole nother thing that I think we should probably talk about, since it's really important for scoping, at least scoping what we're talking about here. And I think that was one of the things that we had called out. So everyone's being very quiet. Do folks think that this captures everything they are interested in? Is it just Monday? Do folks need more coffee?
I think it does. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kavita.
Okay. We also talked about doing a feature parity, like writing down what we have currently in Cosigned and then comparing to what we want to do. So maybe that could also go into.
Sure. So you mean specifically like what we can currently do in the CLI, but not in the web?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good. All right. So
yeah, the KMS would be a good example of that one, right?
Which was that, Jim? Do you mind repeating that?
The KMS support, because I
Oh.
think we could do that in the CLI, but it's a bit difficult to do through a webhook. Or I don't think there's a solution right now to wire that up.
Yeah, it's just literal keys in the secret right now. So,
Right.
so yeah, so we can, let's see. So I guess we can move a bunch of things under here. I don't know that there's explicit support in the CLI yet for multiple keys, although you can call verify multiple times. So let's see.
No, so yeah, that one is common to both, right? Because yeah, even like you said, through the CLI, you would have to invoke it several times. You can't do, if you want like 2 of 6 keys have to be, you know, at least 2 of 6, things like that cannot be done through the CLI today.
I think, let's see, Cosigned Repository definitely fits this. I think one of the interesting things, I'm going to put specify, also root. That's part of this, but not all of this. I think one of the problems that we face in the webhook is, you know, this problem of, you know, configuration for all the possible invocations you'd have. Since, you know, we don't necessarily want one cosigned repository, one full CO root for all of them. So the invocation model is a bit different in the context of Cosign. So there's this sort of meta problem of sort of the mapping. And so I won't put this under like audit what the CLI can do, but I think this is sort of, yeah, so let's see, mapping. Mapping containers to, you know, the configuration options, right? So things like, you know.
Just to make sure I understand that, because I mean, one of the things we talked about last week, and I think we were all on board, which is we really want to go and focus on SDK rising all the bits here. And there will be different projections out of those SDKs. So whether it's CLI or whether it's Cosigned or whether it's other libraries or tools or projects on top of that, then all these capabilities should be exposed via the core SDK, right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so this was just my way of saying that, like, this is a different projection from the CLI, right? Like when I invoke the CLI, I'm giving it a set of options and then like the specific container to apply it to. So there isn't really a mapping problem there. Once you start looking at it in the context of a webhook, the invocation's really the admission request, right? But that you've sort of pre-configured some API objects, right? One or more API objects that say, here are the options, right? So the question is, how do you map the admission request to, you know, the set of options that apply to that admission request? And so that's not really, doesn't feel like it's in the same category as like something that you can currently do with Cosigned, or sorry, the Cosigned CLI, because that just sort of falls out naturally of it being a CLI invocation. But it is sort of a problem that's applies in the context of the sort of admission webhook projection, because the admission request isn't necessarily providing, you know, cosigned repository and all of these things. We need to sort of line those up and figure out which set of those knobs apply.
We've started to play with that a little bit with our PR, our proposed image policy. And there though it's quite small, right? We've just said mapping this image name pattern to right now only a key, but you know, one thing I know we would like in the long run is that ability to support the ability, for example, to store your signatures in a different registry than your images. So I could conceivably say, oh, when matching this image, you're also not only going to match against this key, you're going to look for signatures in this repo or something. Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is covered by the mapping and full CO. Specify full CO root and then mapping containers to different configurations. I think the combination of those does different keys for different repos. Multiple keys. So I still don't think this really does multiple keys. So let's see. Well, okay. There's one thing that sort of covers this, which we haven't touched on yet, but maybe missing in both. The only thing that comes to mind that I think can sort of do this today, although I haven't played with it, is I know that some preliminary support for queue-based policy has landed in the CLI. And I'm not sure whether folks have played with using that for multiple key verification or and or and all that fun stuff. But that's something else that I'll put under here. Let's see, queue-based policies. That's something, just something the CLI can do that don't necessarily have in the webhook today. Put that it's missing in both, even there isn't sort of the literal capability. You might be able to do it through some other capability, but other things we are missing.
So threshold for keys, maybe like and is everything or is one, but we can say 2 to 3 keys or like 4 keys out of the listed keys should work out.
And N of M, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that sounds good.
2 out of 5. Dentists agree that you should deploy this container to prod. Okay. Yeah. Other stuff.
So I had one question, not anything more to add to the list, but there was, you know, on the one of the issues which was talking about the multi-key support, there was a comment from someone working, and I'll put this in chat. Also, there's another library called Secure System Labs, and I don't quite understand or know what the relationship of that library is to what Cosign does, but there was support for like taking multiple verifiers and doing what looked like multi-key verification there.
Is the thing you linked?
Yes.
I believe Secure Systems Lab is more focused on like attestations and stuff like that. Like we in Cosign leverage the Secure Systems Lab, that library for in toto attestation verification.
Okay.
Like you can provide multiple verifiers to their API to like verify any single envelope, and it will return the keys that have verified it. It's kind of a weird API.
Okay. Yeah, because it seems like fundamentally today with Cosign, you kind of provide, you know, a key, and it will go and check and return whether it can verify that the image was signed with that key. But the model that, you know, would provide the flexibility that we would want to apply policies with and or you know, like N of M type of comparison would be for Cosign to just return some set of signed data, which then the policy can go and compare and check, right? So it's almost like flipping that model around.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it is of more use to be like exposing a lower level one-to-one
Right.
API. Like, does this signature, or is this signature signed with this public key, right? And then you can do whatever sort of composition and
Correct.
interesting stuff you want on top of that. But
Right. Because at that point, whether the language is Q or a CRD or Rego doesn't really matter, right?
Mhm.
You just have a SDK, which is
Yeah.
returning the signed data.
Right.
By the way, did I sort out the editing on this doc? I see some folks logged in. Can folks actually edit this, or is it just me?
I mean, I can
We
edit it. I can
Yeah.
do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. I wasn't sure whether I had actually fixed that when I was setting up the new thing. So perfect. Okay, so let's see. So these are some of the gaps. Okay, so if we think that we've captured some of these key things, how do we want to handle some of this sort of composition and organizing this into sort of API structure? Do we want to go through some of the specifics of the current proposal? What do folks want to sort of look at next in terms of digesting some of this stuff? Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, one thing real quick, because I know we were talking about the keys. One thing I think I just saw over there with the Cosigned repository, do we want to also specify multiple Cosigned repositories, like the ability to, because like some people might have, hey, I want to include certain things with the image, but because tooling is not, like won't allow me to do everything along by the image, I might want to say, hey, I want to copy the attestation to two places, one a database and one the image.
So what you're saying is even for a single image, you may want the ability to verify from multiple cosigned repositories, right? Pull attestations from multiple repositories.
Yeah, not ideal, but as an example here, right? There's going to be certain tools we might use that just can't pull from OCI the way that they're structured today. And so we might say, hey, look, for admission control perspective, totally makes sense to push it into and this is more from a writing perspective than necessarily a sort of reading perspective. Because reading, you probably say, hey, I want to just read from one of the things I can hit. But from a writing perspective, you might say, yes, for audit purposes, I'm reading from a database because that's just easier for me to manage. But from admission control perspective, I'm looking at the OC, I'm looking at the image registry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I still do think that even for validation purposes, you might want to hit different registries because there might be things that the image provider provides, some attestations, but some folks might want to do additional things on it, which kind of leads to maybe having to look at different places. But yeah, that was the original motivation why I opened that issue there. But the non-OCI things is going to be interesting as well to think about how we can support that.
Yeah.
It's actually like a good point. I think we do want to support like sort of a repository per signer, because maybe you want to have like individual signers with only permissions to, the sort of the attestations that they're creating with their signatures, if that makes sense. So like you can't really if you want to attest an image multiple times, then you don't want them stepping on each other for whatever reason.
Right. I kind of want to delete this part down here since I think that's missing in both, right? I mean, we don't really have a good answer for the non-OCI storage medium today in the sort of CLI or webhook.
Yeah.
So I think we want support for multiple cosigned repositories, even per image, because the upstream vendor may provide some of the things like SBOMs and signatures saying they produced it. You may attest to other things downstream, but you can't necessarily write those back upstream. So you may write them somewhere else. Something like that. Sure, I buy it. But then also support for non-OCI cosigned repository stuff is definitely interesting, but and complementary to that, but something that's missing in the SDK in general, as well as the CLI and the webhook.
I haven't tried this yet, but wasn't there some recent support for like air gap environments with?
Yeah. So that was still OCI. To be a little pedantic,
Okay.
still OCI, but it was not registry. It was support for OCI layouts. So you could write an OCI layout that contained possibly the image and the signatures or attestations. I'm not sure that all the signatures, attestations, and SBOMs are all plumbed through yet. I should go and check. But
I believe it's only signatures.
yeah, but one of them was done, and the others are very
Okay.
similar. So it should just mostly be plumbing for those now, but that's still OCI effectively. It's just a different medium of OCI image. So
yeah, so with Kubernetes policies, we have the similar requests, right, on being able to vary or separate the registry. So once you match on a particular image, you can specify a repo, and since it's calling cosign underneath, each time it's setting the repo based on the invocation. So the signature repo can then be varied based on namespace or based on, you know, the image match itself.
I'm curious what folks want to do around things like precedence, and maybe this is another good place to sort of look at what Kubernetes done for this, right? Like if you have one API object that just configures everything for the cluster, that's like great. But like if I want to have sort of n fragments of policy that sort of compose to form the overall policy, right? Dealing with things like collisions, right, and whatnot on images. How do folks want to sort of approach that aspect of things? This gets into how we do mapping.
I wonder if the ability to validate against multiple keys just basically precludes the existence of a collision per se, right? Is that if we have, and so our example uses pattern matching for image names, and so that suggests that you could match, well, multiple signatures throughout a cluster's configuration, right? Would those become collisions, or would that expand the list of keys that you may validate against? You know, our first naive implementation says that if a single, for example, it's an OR, so if a single key validates, that's not the part I want to get hung up on, but it's just to say that it's quite simple if we can build the list, if that's adequate. Now, you did mention precedence. I wonder if order makes precedence, but order isn't implied by multiple matches across multiple potential configurations.
It seems like the safe way to handle this, like if you have a policy where you're just like saying for image that looks like this glob, it must have this policy must be, you know, it must satisfy this policy. It seems like the safe way to do it would just be, you know, and policy A and policy B and policy C.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think across policies and is so every policy you can kind of think of it as atomic to some degree, right? And it has to kind of
Yeah.
pass or fail in isolation.
So-
But within a policy, if you want to support multiple keys, that's where it kind of comes back to doing like, like 3 of 6 or something, or like saying if I want an OR rule that I want
Yeah.
any of these keys. That's where we've also kind of seen several requests for, well, can I just match by a root CA, which is a slightly different feature, but kind of more flexibility within a single policy itself.
I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. It's like what we really need to be doing is like focusing on how to implement policies. So it's like, the keys that are used and the way that the policies are verified are implementation details, but we need to be focusing on ensuring that the semantics for like the policy engine is correct.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking like, one thing that you'd want is like, this image was built on this, in this pipeline, it was attested by this thing that's saying it's good for, it has gone through all of its integration testing and staging, it's good for prod, that sort of thing. Like those are really common, and policies that,
Yeah.
people want.
So one that actually made me think of another aspect of this that we may want to sort of think about as interesting framing, which is the audience for folks configuring some of this stuff. I could see folks wanting to be able to configure certain policies for, their team within their namespace, but, a cluster operator wanting certain global policies for the entire cluster, right? And so really, that isn't necessarily an or, right? They may have certain policies they want applied to everything and certain policies that, are then included by, configured by your team within your namespace or something like that. So another way of looking at it might be that the different sort of fragments of policy may come into play because there are actually multiple authors of policies at different layers of the stack, and how we blend those. So I don't know if folks have thought about it much from that perspective. Or maybe we should have a like, who are the audience for this conversation? But
right. Yeah, I think the important thing there is to sort of not allow a policy, a namespace policy, for example, to override or negate what a cluster-wide policy does, right? So as long as each policy is applied in isolation and can does its thing, so it's always seemed, at least the approach again we've taken with Kyverno is it's always an and across policies, but within a policy there could be flexibility. And you can only match certain namespaces, things to that nature, or workloads through any other label or identifier.
yeah.
Hey, I have one question. Have we decided what this policy is going to be? Is it going to be a config map or a CRD?
I mean, I think we want to head towards CRD. I think the question is sort of what the schema and scope of the CRD is, as well as, if you have a CRD, is it cluster scope? Is it namespace scope? Which sort of gets into audience, but also,
I think it's safe to say that we know uses for both. Like, I think we should just admit, like, it should be both cluster and namespace scope.
Yeah.
And both of those should be in, like, and. Is that safe to say at this point?
So I will repeat back what you said, and folks can throw things at me.
I said it so poorly.
So there are use cases for defining things at a cluster scope. There are use cases for defining policies at a namespace scope. They should, I think, be evaluated in isolation, and all of them should need to be like passed to allow a thing through.
Yeah,
right.
That was so much better than how I said it. I should just make you say all the things I say.
So I think that means and of policies. Yes.
Maybe or within a policy.
Yeah, within a, so this is completely independent of sort of the within a policy thing. I figure that's some of the stuff we were talking about, sort of up here with multiple keys and stuff like that. I think we still need a way of doing that, but sort of, let's pretend for a moment that we've sort of figured out our API for within a thing. I can author that policy, and it's perfect. It's wonderful. Right. But now I have n of these things. How do we rationalize that? Right. So,
I just have a quick question about that, because I don't think it necessarily implies that we need to have CRDs both at the cluster and namespace level. And I don't think we need the rat hole on that. But thinking about it for 10 seconds, I could certainly see cases where that is not a hard requirement. But.
Well, we could also potentially do things like have the cluster, like if the source of truth is the namespace thing, the cluster thing can spit out namespace things as well, based on like in the CRD that's linked, for instance, there's like the include exclude thing, right? And so namespaces that are excluded may not get the namespace scoped thing, but the cluster scoped thing may spit out namespace things in each of the namespaces, for instance.
Right.
That's makes sense as the way to, configure source of truth. But
yeah, so a couple of interesting points to consider on that, right? So in Kyverno, we've had support for namespace policies from the beginning, but we haven't, and in fact, the implementation, much like you're describing, will kind of translate every namespace policy to a cluster policy internally with the right namespace filter, right? So they're kind of one-to-one compatible, and there's no difference really in implementation. It's just the filter that's applied. But we haven't seen much usage of namespace policies, and I don't know why. Maybe it's just too early, right? And it's everybody applies policies at the cluster level, and
sorry. I would guess that the reason is because you really, really, really want namespace policies if you're trying to accomplish multi-tenancy, and like right now, no one is.
Exactly.
It's not ready. It's like no one thought to make namespace things. So yeah, it's just kind of too difficult. Everyone is still having a cluster per team basically.
Most likely, yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
On that front, I'm currently only using namespace policies in our dev cluster because obviously so for example, we're building, we have that thing, the secure software factory, right? That allows us to sort of build everything. And so we have a set of policies that applies specifically to the namespaces where we're actually building stuff. And then we have stuff in the sort of conceptual namespace. We have a namespace set of policies there. But if we were to move that to production, we'd obviously completely separate the cluster that we're running our builds in from the thing that we're actually running the production workloads in. But so I mean, right now I think it's mostly from a dev and QA perspective that we're kind of doing that.
Got it. Okay.
Sort of thing.
I also think there's sort of a bias right now towards sort of who cares about this, whose hair's on fire, and I think it's mostly the platform operators that are caring. That's why there's a lot of focus on the cluster things. I think once this becomes a bit more sort of commonplace and maybe commoditized, it will be more sort of run of the mill for a team to be like, okay, well, I can configure certain policies, or once it's sort of run of the mill, the tests to certain things, right? And there's good infrastructure in place to check those attestations, right? Folks may sort of pile onto it, but it still feels very, very nascent.
I also
sorry, GK would definitely prefer if you didn't run a cluster per like little thing that you're doing. That's basically why they had to get rid of free control plane.
I also think on some of the clusters, you're going to have folks that like different teams are going to be running different speeds. So as much as we would like there to be like, everybody comes into work on Monday and the flag gets put into the happy flag state, I think there's going to be, in larger organizations, it's going to take a lot of time for different teams to get to the same state. And some teams might not ever want to get to that state
True.
or various levels. So
That's a good point. You're sort of like exchanging, you lower your cost for maintaining the control plane, but you increase your cost for like SRE.
Yeah.
Which is what Google chose, but whatever. Why doesn't everyone want to be like Google? Google's great. Blank silence.
Yes, on the image policy, though, I think it's interesting to think about who would own it, right? And if, we do envision that a workload owner starts writing image policies, and you could have maybe a cluster-wide policy that enforces that each workload contains an image policy, things like that, then it makes sense to have a namespace policy, right? So I think it's good to design for that, but it's just the usage will most likely be cluster-wide upfront.
Okay. So I've been trying to scribble notes about various aspects of what we've been discussing. I apologize if I'm butchering stuff, but feel free to go in and fiddle with stuff or help take notes. Let's see. So are there other specific things that we think we should touch on, or should we dive into? I think we're sort of this is actually an interesting one, but I think we are sort of in agreement about sort of seeing uses for cluster and namespace scope. There's some interesting anecdotal data about sort of how Kyverno's seen this track, but I think we're all sort of in agreement about and of policies. What do folks think about this? How uncovered images are handled bit? Flag on the webhook. I mean, maybe the answer is with and of policies, if you want it to be deny all, you just have a policy that's a wild card, right?
Yeah, putting on like the security engineer hat, it should be like, it should definitely default like fail closed, right? And that it would be really, as soon as you try out that policy and everything blows up, then it's like, oh, I forgot to add like a allow */* or whatever.
Yeah, and this is also just a problem with how admission controllers are currently set up, just in Kubernetes, where like if the admission controller crashes, Kubernetes by default fails open. Which, I mean, that's outside of the scope of this, but
I mean, it's configured at the webhook level, right? There's the default may be to fail open, but I'm pretty sure you specify the failure policy in the webhook.
So like one of my aspirational goals is to actually start doing some of this policy enforcement in the runtime. I think like Cosign needs to win a bit harder in order for us to be able to convince anyone that this should be in container D. But like basically for that reason, and especially like as an operator of Kubernetes, you don't have the advantage of having Kubernetes to deal with this policy for you. So it'd be good to actually have some way to enforce some policy on images before a cluster is actually stood up. And really the only way to do that is like at the runtime.
So by runtime here, you're referring to the container engine before it actually runs that image?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't think there's any way that, Cosigned Policy is going to find its way into container D anytime soon. But one can dream.
Never. Not there yet.
Yep.
I mean, I also think that there's value in doing it at the control plane level as well as the, you know.
Right, but like, there's no reason why, you know, control plane can't be feeding that like policy into, you know, the container runtime. I mean, it's like that's what the kubelet's for. That's what it does. It stuffs good policy into the runtime.
Okay. Should we talk about these scoping things? Key rotation. Maybe the answer for key rotation is integration with some of the foreign key stuff like KMS systems, or support was also mentioned as one of the things that enables key rotation, manual key rotation. There are aspects of this that we think, let's see, maybe we should just put this as, yeah. Okay. Is everyone okay with punting on sort of this being part of the, like, what is the shape of the API resource conversation?
I feel like there are workarounds that, you know, you could expire one key within a policy, expire one key, add another key, and still be able to move forward based on the assumptions we have, the vague assumptions we have right now. So maybe we can punt on it a little bit. I think I said last week, there are good examples of how JWKS handles key rotation. I'm Web of Trust years old, so, you know, there's always forward signing of keys, which introduces features nobody liked then. Nobody's going to like them now. Okay, I like them, but I'm comfortable being alone in that.
Okay, so I'm going to say there should be a requirement on the API. It should be possible to do manually, but we should support external keys from things like KMS, which should make this easier, right? But
I mean, what if we just support secrets and secrets support KMS? If that makes sense. Like, you know, just lean on, you know, the objects we already have.
when you say secret support KMS, there is this. Can we just make the cosigned verification key use KMS today?
Yes, I mean yes, that'd be great. I mean, I don't see why there's any reason why we couldn't.
Want to reply to that issue?
All
right.
I mean, I think technically we already do in that sense. Like, as long as the key is correct. I don't know. I'd have to look.
We that is something we should document better if
Yes.
we want folks to trampoline through secrets for KMS. Although, I mean, does that have the KMS system copy stuff into the secret?
I mean, it depends. It depends on the implementation of the secret.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And yes, so possibly replace KMS here with something that can devolve to KMS, but we should make sure that, you know, to this point of making sure that we cover everything that the CLI covers. Yeah. We should make sure that there's a story. In the context of Kubernetes, I could see that story being like lean on some functionality in Kubernetes that gives us the KMS stuff, but we should make sure that there aren't, like, you know, big caveats to that, like, you know, copying secrets from a KMS system into Kubernetes secrets or something like that. That might put folks, you know, off. Do we want to talk about this before we jump into I think we should talk about this before we jump into the sort of API conversation. Yeah.
Is this
So-
purely continuous or is it on policy change?
So it could be policy change, resource change, or even external data change, right? Like attestations, things like that. So I think it has to be periodic plus on triggers.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the path of least resistance would be on resource change.
So I think my bigger concern here is what supporting mechanics exist in the context of Kubernetes. I like enabling this. I'm worried that specifically in the context of Kubernetes, that there are good facilities in place. Well, I say good, Michael, don't give me any funny looks, for admission control in the context of Kubernetes. But once the resource has been admitted, right, and you are doing sort of a background audit of that resource, your recourse when it falls out of policy is like your hands are sort of tied. You can't say deny because it's already been admitted. So
Right.
I think it becomes a really interesting question of, you know, what the sort of recourse is. So I think we can think about the policy in sort of a more general sense, but I worry about sort of the mechanics that come out of this task force being too open-ended if we, you know, need to solve some of those problems that haven't been solved in the context of Kubernetes, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah, like the ugly way that people usually accomplish this is just do like a dry run and see which pods would get reaped, right?
Yeah. Does my concern resonate with folks? I totally get that this is something that, you know, folks will need to do. I'm just worried about us trying to standardize on something where the sort of somewhat foundational mechanics don't exist. And so maybe this is, maybe we can go beyond sort of the like, okay, Cosigned as an SDK should support these kinds of scenarios. Like we can talk about, as we're talking about the API, enabling those kinds of scenarios with the resources as well. But I worry about our ability to actually deliver a reference implementation of that without facilities like we have with admission control to actually do things like deny and whatnot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think it can be separated out, can be done also later as a, you know, layer on top. And if we're building an SDK, there should be no reason why you can't run that as a job and report on certain things, right?
Yeah, I think the thing in my head is like, what does report look like? Because it seems like a super high degree integration point. You know, we could maybe have a webhook or something like that, but like once you start to get into that territory, it gets fun.
Right. Yeah, so the policy working group in Kubernetes, there is a CRD that's being proposed as a, you know, kind of not really a standard, but as a common report format, which there have been integrations because Kubernetes supports that, as well as Falco and Kubebench, Kubearmor, a few tools are supporting that. So that could be one option to kind of just use that policy report CRD.
Do you have a link to that I can include in the notes?
Yeah, let me pull that up. Okay, yeah, just put it in chat.
Yeah, I will link that in here. Oh, we are dangerously low on time. Let me notes. Okay. I will throw this into here. So so this is the policy report.
Right.
I will link that here. Thank you for that pointer there. Okay, so I think that we're getting close in terms of scoping on some of these things. I think the main thing that I think we still really need to dive into is the actual like API shape, given some of the constraints I think we've been talking about. And I think a lot of the sort of constraints we've been talking about have definitely helped sort of frame things in my head in terms of what kinds of shapes we would need for the actual API resources. Does that make sense as sort of next topic? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Are folks cool with meeting this Friday? I know folks are going to start disappearing. Yeah.
Works. Yeah, I mean, I'm off, but I'll still attend.
I'm good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
I might
cool.
even be awake by the end of the meeting.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's plan to do this Friday, and then we can sort of suspend these until after the new year, because folks are going to disappear. I will try and get this recording up as soon after this meeting as we can and finish typing up some of these notes. But thanks, everyone, for the discussion, and I'll see, hopefully, a bunch of you on Friday.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right, bye.
Ciao.